Hi, good afternoon in Manila. It's evening in Melbourne. My name is Bea Cupin. I am still in Melbourne, Australia. The to covering as I was live 2 days ago, covering the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit. Well, it just ended a few hours ago, actually, and in fact, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is en route back to Manila. So I'm here to walk you through what happened, what didn't happen, what he said wrong, and what he didn't say while here in Melbourne. So again, ano ba yung point ng ASEAN-Australia Summit? Well, Australia wants to deepen its ties with the Southeast Asian bloc um, because it wants to, because of proximity, no? Ang lapit-lapit ng Australia sa atin, but also because it has no choice. Now, si Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese the other day emphasized the importance of Southeast Asia. He cited earlier projections na by 2040, the bloc will be among the biggest economies in the world. So that gives you an understanding, a better understanding as to why Australia would care so much about improving ties and deepening, especially trade ties, particularly no, with ASEAN. But also another area of focus for Australia in engaging with ASEAN would of course be yung maritime security at yung tinatawag nilang blue economy. And we will be talking about that a little later. So a rundown of what the president has been doing here in or has done here in Melbourne pagdating niya dito. He had, I guess, one of the first highlights of his engagements in Australia was a speech before the Lowy Institute. It's a Sydney-based think tank, but they hosted him here in Melbourne. We'll talk about his speech a little bit more because it ties into maritime security and the West Philippine Sea, obviously. After that, he had a gathering of the Filipino community here in Australia. Again, parang kumbaga standard na yan sa lahat ng biyahe ng Pangulo abroad, and he has very many trips abroad. And while in Australia, he had media interviews, and we will also be talking about that just a little bit. And of course, the summit itself, which actually, apat na araw, andito yung Pangulo, dumating siya sa March 3. Sa March 4, kumbaga side events lang talaga yung nangyari or side engagements. Yung mismo summit was convened, or rather the leaders of ASEAN were officially welcomed to Melbourne on the 5th. And then on the 6th, which is today, the last day of the leaders here in Melbourne was the actual summit. So yun yung mga actual formal gathering of ASEAN leaders and of course, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. So it was announced also on the second day, technically, of President Marcos here in Melbourne. The government announced $1.53 billion in investments from Australian companies. Now we have to emphasize na these are, although MOUs and letters of intent were signed, parang kumbaga wala pang, hindi man literally na susulpot yung mga investments na ito tomorrow. But contracts have been signed and letters of intent have been signed, and that's something that obviously the Philippine government bannered and highlighted during the first day of the president here in Australia. Kasi yung summit kasi bukod sa mismong meetings ng leaders, meron din siyang parang tracks is what they call it, parang side events. So on the 4th, actually nagsimula yung four of the 5 special tracks that Australia wanted to introduce during the ASEAN-Australia Summit. So yung unang track or yung unang theme rather would be trade. So nag-host sila ng CEO Summit pati ng small and medium enterprise gatherings, so SMEs and CEOs. They also hosted a track on maritime security and the blue economy. There were also discussions bringing together emerging leaders in the region, referring again to ASEAN and Australia as well. And of course, there's also a gathering talking about green energy or renewables, because Australia is trying to position itself as a superpower in renewable energy. Again, I discussed this the last time, bakit sila interesado in engaging with ASEAN or Southeast Asia in terms of energy. It's because Australia is a huge country, but its population is not hindi siya as densely populated, say, as ASEAN. And it looks to ASEAN as a potential market for their renewables because they need a huge market to scale up. And related to maritime security, Australia made pledges announced by its Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, and we can talk about that much later. You can Google that and check out the parang yung pledges ng Australia dun, kasi it wasn't really there weren't quite details yet. Parang total figure lang siya over X number of years to support maritime development, environmental protection in the Southeast Asian region. Now, as I mentioned earlier, no, ang daming engagement ng Pangulo dito during his 3.5 days in Melbourne. So one engagement that did make headlines was the president being interviewed by an anchor from Australia's ABC, where he was asked about his father's bloody legacy. Now, the interesting thing here is actually it's the second time, kumbaga, during his second visit to Australia in a span of a week, no, Albanese actually, or rather, sorry, it was the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia who pointed this out. Marcos might just be the first world leader to have visited Australia twice in such a short span of time. He was in Canberra on February 29 rather, for an address to their parliament, and then bumalik siya ulit dito on March 3 for the summit. So he was confronted, and he unfortunately, or rather awkwardly, laughed in response to the difficult question of him, of his father's legacy, and of whether he has dealt with it, and whether did he not want to for the Philippines to seize the properties or the money that the Marcos clan owes it. There's actually Dwight De Leon, who reports on Malacanang for Rappler, has a story on that as well. Now, talking about the Lowy Institute speech, it was one of the president's fierier speeches, especially because it touches on the West Philippine Sea. In a way, it was a continuation of his earlier assertions during his address to Parliament in Canberra, in the Parliament of Australia. So doon, parang sinabi niya na the Philippines, as in the 40s during World War II, finds itself in the front lines. And in a way, the Philippines serves as a buffer for Australia amid tensions in the region. So that's how he put it. And here naman, he was emphasizing ostensibly the discussion at Lowy was for him to talk about where the Philippines stands in the midst of great power rivalry in the region, but also in the world. So this assertion is nothing new from the president, actually. What the Philippines, what Marcos has been saying is that we should not look at, well, earlier in ASEAN in Jakarta, he said that we should not look at the South China Sea tensions through the lens of just China and the US competing against each other. Dito naman ang sinabi niya, the Indo-Pacific should be careful about viewing tensions in the region through the lens of great power rivalry, or sabi niya rin, hindi dapat gawing arena ng competition ng great powers itong Southeast Asia. And also that harkens to the fact that the Philippines is a middle power. It's not high up in the rank of middle powers. Australia is also a middle power, pero medyo malayo yung agwat ng Australia at ng Philippines, but we're both middle powers. And it's actually a stand that the Albanese government shares, no? Na they want to harness the powers of middle powers who share the same interests, have the same interests, share the same values, perhaps, in the rules-based order, international law, to ensure that the South China Sea and any other body of water really is safe, secure, because as Albanese himself pointed out, and Secretary Manalo of the Philippines, President Marcos has also echoed this, like Australia, we are an island nation and we are very much dependent on trade. Ngayon, inulit niya tong assertion na ito, no? Yung realization or yung assertion na we should not look at the dynamics of geopolitics merely through the lens of parang US, China rivalries, but as an assertion of yung the will or the intentions or the plans of a sovereign state. So he said this earlier during the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit Leaders Retreat, and let me just read a part of it. Scrolling through the text. So you also know kung bakit retreat, bakit intervention, what are these words I'm I'm using. So an intervention is basically a leader, or in the case of like a minister's meeting, a minister making a speech, para stating his government's position. So when the president speaks during the retreat or the leaders summit, he is expressing the position of the country that he leads. So ang sabi ng Pangulo kanina, it is thus my government's position that we will not yield an inch of our sovereign territory, as we are committed to defending our rights within the parameters recognized by international law. It therefore behooves the Philippines, ASEAN, and Australia, and all like-minded states to exercise the boldness and sense of responsibility to remain committed to the peaceful resolution of disputes and to maintain respect for the rules-based international order and multilateralism, especially in the face of deliberate efforts by others to denigrate, deny, and even violate international law. These words are parang it's not exactly surprising coming from President Marcos, but perhaps we should contextualize it sa fact that this was delivered today, March 6, and on March 5, that was yesterday, in Ayungin Shoal in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines experienced what is possibly the worst or the most concerning or disturbing case of harassment from Chinese vessels during a resupply mission to Ayungin Shoal, where the BRP Sierra Madre serves as our military outpost. So kahapon, during a RORE mission in the morning, mga morning ng March 5, bukod sa pagharang sa dangerous maneuvers ng China Coast Guard at ng Chinese Maritime Militia sa mga barko ng Pilipinas, PCG boats, at maliliit na civilian boats na the Philippine Navy contracts to bring supplies to BRP Sierra Madre, nagkaroon ng at least two collision incidents, one between the PCG and the CCG, the Philippine Coast Guard and the China Coast Guard, and another collision incident between the China Coast Guard and the Unaiza May 4, one of the civilian ships that the Philippine Navy uses to bring supplies and troops to the BRP Sierra Madre. So bukod doon, pagkatapos ng collision ay ginamitan ng dalawang water cannon ng China Coast Guard, yung Unaiza May 4, which by the way on board was also the Westcom commander, si Vice Admiral Carlos. So dahil sa pressure ng water cannons ng Coast Guard, na by the way, you are not supposed, or you don't expect Coast Guards to use water cannons in such potentially in a way that could potentially injure or harm other people or other vessels, no? So that's the pressure ng water cannons, two water cannons hitting the Unaiza May at the same time. There's a video of this actually. Nabasag yung windshield ng Unaiza May 4, injuring 4. Now we're told from a press briefing earlier by the NTF-WPS, nagkaroon lang naman ng minor cuts. Thankfully, it was only minor cuts sa 4 na Navy personnel on board the Unaiza May. So that's the context of President Marcos saying that. But later on, in fact, he actually did say something explicitly reacting to what happened in Ayungin Shoal, and let's listen to the president.
I do not think that it is the time or the reason to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. However, we continue to view with great alarm this continuing dangerous maneuvers and dangerous actions that are being done against our seamen, our Coast Guard, and in this time they damaged the cargo ship and caused some injury to some of our seamen. And I think that we cannot view this in any way but in the most serious way. Once again, we will make our objections known and hope that we can continue to communicate to find a way so that such actions are no longer seen in the West Philippine Sea.
The president did not elaborate on what those actions would be to prevent another case like this happening in the West Philippine Sea. Now, this doesn't come entirely as a surprise in that a lot of experts have been warning or have been expressing concern na parang given all the tensions in the West Philippine Sea, particularly in Ayungin Shoal during these RORE missions, na parang inevitable. It was a matter of time na may masaktan as a result of China's actions against the Philippines. Now, thankfully, it is in this case it was injuries from the glass actually of the windshield shattering from the pressure of the water cannon. So the Ayungin incident was not particularly brought up during the summit formally, but also today the State Department of the U.S. did issue a statement condemning China, but also affirming na any action or military action in the South China Sea on a Philippine vessel, including a PCG vessel, would be basis for invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty, and that's why the president led his answer by saying it is not the time nor the reason, or there's no reason to invoke the MDT. So ano itong MDT? It's a decades-old treaty na kung baga nagpangako ang Philippines at yung US na if either country is attacked in a specific manner, we can invoke the treaty and ask for the other's defense. So we can do that, they can do that. It's a long process of which defense diplomacy officials tend to not prefer to dwell on. They usually say it's too premature to think about that. I guess they want to cross the bridge only when we get there. The president also made a comment on Benham Rice because over the weekend there were reports that Chinese research vessels were spotted in Benham Rice. Now, to be clear, and even the president seemed to get this wrong and got confused. Yung Benham Rice ay wala sa West Philippine Sea. So if the West Philippine Sea is to the west of the Philippines, Benham Rice is on the other side of the Philippines. So totally different body of water. Hindi ito kiniklaim ng China, at least not yet, as opposed to the West Philippine Sea, which is part of the South China Sea, which they claim in their entirety, despite a 2016 arbitral ruling saying mali sila. So ngayon siguro, yung tanong natin sa recap na to, no, what does the Philippines gain from the Melbourne visit? Now, Malacanang will give you the figures of the 1.53 billion na pledge ng mga businesses dito sa Australia. And by the way, bigger strategy din ng Australian government is to encourage its private sector to invest more, not just in the Philippines, but in Southeast Asia. So this also checks with the strategy of Australia. Actually, meron sa Indo-Pacific economic strategy. Like they really want to, or actually ASEAN investment strategy, they really want to increase two-way trade between the bloc and Australia. So beyond the trade numbers, though, I think what we might want to think about now is whether this effort by the Philippine government, and not just by President Marcos, no, this is as the cliche goes, a whole of government approach. You have diplomats, you have defense officials. By the way, the AFP chief, Romeo Bronner, was here. NSA Secretary Anyo was here. Like they were part of the delegation. It's not clear if they had side events, or at least hindi pa ina-announce kung meron silang side engagements habang andito sila sa Australia. But that just might be the case. Kaya sila sinama dito. So parang more than the trade numbers or the pledges, which is also quite important, obviously, and more than the pledge of Australia to aid ASEAN sa mga maritime affairs, environmental issues, siguro yung itanong natin dito, parang itong the push for the Marcos administration and officials in government to garner more support for the Philippines in its West Philippine Sea problem. Like, are these trips adding to that? And are they adding to the coalition that we are informally building that support UNCLOS, also support the 2016 arbitral ruling that told China na no, mali yung 9-dash na 10-dash line nyo sa South China Sea. And siguro yung more than an achievement, what I want to leave with you is the question, no, na parang what does the Philippines need to still work on in the context of Ayungin Shoal, of Scarborough Shoal, Ag-asa Island, the greater West Philippine Sea, and maybe hopefully not soon, but Benham Rice as well, no? Parang kasi Benham Rice is bigger than Luzon, it's believed to have a lot of natural resources under it. We have yet to truly fully explore Benham Rice. So siguro, yun yung tanong, as Marcos urges ASEAN and our partners, kasi given na yun parang Australia is a very committed partner to the Philippines, especially in the arena of defense. In fact, it's one of two countries who we have a visiting forces agreement with. The other country is the United States. There are other countries lining up for a VFA-like arrangement. Japan wants an RAA, yung term nila for a VFA. Canada wants a VFA as well. Kakasign lang ng MOU on defense. There's an MOU now on defense with the United Kingdom. So those countries are already committed or have already been explicit in their support for the Philippines. But the question is, like, who are the other countries that we can convince? Through under Marcos, we've had countries stand up and be more vocal about supporting the Philippines. You have India, South Korea have expressed their support amid cases of Chinese harassment in the West Philippine Sea. Siguro to part, during the retreat also, yung to end the speech, the president said, it is the Philippines' hope that ASEAN continues to collectively and constructively address challenges together, which is an interesting statement, given that experts will tell you and ASEAN countries are not shy naman to admit that we have very different ways of engaging with China, with the US, with the two superpowers. Sabi din ni President Marcos, we encourage our ASEAN neighbors to frame conflicts not simply as rivalry between major powers, but as direct challenges to the sovereignty of independent states whose well-being, both politically and economically, are interdependent and intertwined. So that's going to be an interesting thing. Na yung ASEAN bloc kasi, it's been infamous for being so harmonious na sometimes hindi nagkaka-agree at hindi nagkaka-stand sa mga bagay-bagay. Myanmar is one thing, like, ang daming criticism, it was so slow to respond to that. The West Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, parang it has not been so bold as to make statements on what's happening between the Philippines and China and other claimant states, actually. Although the ASEAN ministers did issue a statement in late December last year. So, and even during the summit here, parang iba-iba yung expressions ng different leaders of ASEAN when asked about tensions in the South China Sea and the situation between China and claimant states in ASEAN. So that will be an interesting thing. The president is traveling again in a few days, actually. So he arrives probably, he'll arrive on the 7th, the early 7th of March. The week after that, he travels to Germany and the Czech Republic for visits. Those have been announced. We don't know the details yet of those trips, but he will be traveling there. So we don't know yet for now kung ano yung agenda, kung ano yung pinaka-main goal ng Pangulo dun. But again, if before the parang overlying message was we're going around the world to sell the Philippines, to sell the economy of the Philippines, to tell investors that we're a safe country to invest in, or that we're open to investment, I think the overlying message now of the Marcos administration is to rally countries to rally behind the rules-based order, which is surprisingly, given the tricky geopolitics, not just of the region, but of the world now. It's not an easy sell sometimes. So I leave you with that. Again, this has been Bea Cupin. I am in Melbourne, and hopefully in a few days, hours actually, I won't be in Melbourne anymore. But if you have questions or you have comments, yun nga, parang kunwari, on ASEAN, is there hope for ASEAN to make a stand on the South China Sea or pick a side? Is there picking of a side? You can hand on over to the Global Security channel on the Rappler Communities app, where you can have discussions there. I saw there was an interesting conversation on the governance app naman, on Marcos's gaffe, or a very awkward moment with the journalist here in Australia. So if you go there, there's actually a QR code that's being flashed on screen now. You can download the app, You can talk to me if you would want to for some reason, but you can also talk to other thought leaders, other rap reporters. We'll share our insights if we have any, or if you have time, and then we can talk about the daily events that concerns our beats, which in my case is defense and diplomacy for Rappler. Again, I am Bea Cupin. It has been 25 minutes of me talking to you. If you're still watching, if you watch from the beginning to the end, thank you for your time. Uh, and I hope to see you again soon, but hopefully not in Melbourne anymore. Thank you for watching. Good night.